April 1945. Inside a Soviet tank, deep in the ruins of Berlin, four men can barely hear themselves think. The engine roars. The tracks grind over broken stone. The air is thick with brick dust and gun smoke. Their tank is a monster, nearly 50 tons of steel, built around one enormous 122mm gun. Ahead, a building bristles with German defenders' machine guns and Panzerfausts trained on the street. The commander picks his target. The gunner lays that huge barrel onto the wall, frees it right there, one heartbeat before the gun fires. Because everything about this single moment is a paradox. This tank is not the most powerful machine on the battlefield. It isn't even close. Out in the ruins of the dying Reich, scattered along the roads, sit tanks twice as deadly as this one. German King Tigers, 70-ton giants, with guns that can kill from over a mile away. On paper, this Soviet tank should not be here at all. It should be a smoking wreck. Yet it's this tank, the weaker one, that has clawed its way into the heart of Hitler's capital. Those magnificent King Tigers, most of them never even reached this fight. Many were found abandoned and undamaged, blown up by their own crews, simply out of fuel. The finest tank ever built, dying by the roadside without a scratch on it. This tank, cheaper, cruder, lighter even, carries a name that says everything. It's the IS-2. The Joseph Stalin. It's driving Stalin's own name straight into the ruins of the Reich. So how on earth did that happen? How does the worst tank end up smashing its way into Berlin, while the best tank in the world ends up as scrap by the side of the road? The answer has almost nothing to do with armor or guns. It comes down to a single, deeper question. Not which tank was more powerful, but what each tank was actually built to do. Because these two machines were built for two completely different wars. The King Tiger was built to slow down a defeat that was already coming. The IS-2 was built to end the war. One was a fortress, the other was a battering ram. In the last year of the war, only one of those jobs actually mattered. To see how it happened, we have to rewind and meet them both, starting with the monster the whole world learned to fear. By 1943, Germany was frightened again. Its feared Tiger One was no longer king of the battlefield. By now, the Soviets had upgunned their tanks and were building new heavy machines that could fight back. So the German High Command demanded something even bigger, a heavy tank that nothing could survive. And once again, two great firms were pitted against each other. Henschel and Porsche. If that rivalry sounds familiar, it should. This was the exact same duel that had produced the original Tiger 2 years before, and Ferdinand Porsche made the exact same mistake all over again. So certain he would win, he had turrets built in advance, before the contest was even decided. And once again, his design leaned on a complex electric drive that devoured copper, a metal Germany still didn't have. And once again, Porsche lost. The practical Henschel design won, and Porsche's pre-built turrets were simply bolted onto the first 50 tanks, so they wouldn't go to waste. Porsche's humiliation with the King Tiger should have ended his tank ambitions for good. Instead, it led to the single most absurd war machine ever built. Because Hitler had a sickness, and it was slowly bleeding the German war effort dry. He was obsessed with size bigger tanks, thicker armor, more powerful guns, always more. And to a leader who worshipped size, Ferdinand Porsche, the man who kept losing, must have seemed like a kindred spirit. So Hitler handed Porsche a contract for a tank beyond all reason. It was called the Mouse, one of history's great dark jokes in naming. Because the Mouse weighed 188 tons. To this day, it remains the heaviest armored vehicle ever built. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank from over 3 kilometers away. Its armor was simply impervious, and it was, in every way that actually mattered, completely useless. At 188 tons, it couldn't cross a single ordinary bridge. It was far too heavy for any railway. It could barely crawl, and it drank fuel at a rate that was pure fantasy at a time when Germany had almost none left. Keeping just a handful of them running would have taken an entire fleet of support vehicles. Only one German general saw the madness clearly, Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg. He looked at the Maus and understood it was a monstrous waste of everything Germany could no longer spare. In the end, only 2 were ever built, and neither fired a shot in anger. But the mouse tells you everything about the mind that also built the King Tiger. It was a nation chasing the perfect, unstoppable monster, while losing the war for want of simple, ordinary tanks. By almost any measure, the machine they built was the finest heavy tank of the war. Its gun was a monster, a long-barreled 88, even more powerful than the one on the original Tiger. That gun could destroy an enemy tank from well over 2 kilometers away before its target could even see it clearly. Its accuracy was terrifying too, striking targets at ranges other tanks could only dream of. Its armor was just as absurd. Up front sat as much as 180 millimeters of thick, sloping steel. Allied and Soviet shells hammered that glacis and simply shattered against it. From the front, the King Tiger was very nearly impossible to kill. On a good day, in the right hands, a single King Tiger could hold off an entire attacking force. So, again, if this were about pure power, the story would be over. But the King Tiger carried a fatal contradiction built right into its steel. Everything that made it so powerful also made it almost useless where it mattered most. Start with how few there were. The King Tiger was the most expensive tank Germany ever built, and brutally complex to manufacture. Allied bombers pounded the factories, and in the end, only around 500 were ever completed. 500 against the tens of thousands of tanks the Allies were pouring out. Then there was the weight. At nearly 70 tons, the King Tiger was a giant, but Germany gave it the same engine that powered the much lighter Panther. That engine was hopelessly overworked, dragging all that steel around. This tank was slow, it guzzled fuel, and its range was pitifully short. And fuel was the one thing Germany was running out of completely. By 1944, Allied bombers had found Germany's single greatest weakness, the plants that made its fuel. Wave after wave of heavy bombers pounded the synthetic fuel refineries into rubble. Germany's fuel production didn't just fall. It collapsed down to a tiny fraction of what it had been. By the last months of the war, the Wehrmacht was never more than a few weeks away from running completely dry. Whole divisions sat frozen in place, immobilized, waiting for fuel that would never come. Germany was trying to fight a war of movement with almost nothing left to move on. Into that fuel-starved army, they delivered the thirstiest tank they had ever built. The King Tiger could drain its enormous tanks in just a few dozen kilometers. In a cruel irony, it was the perfect tank to run out of gas. Worse still, all that weight wrecked the tank from the inside. Its transmission, its steering, its tracks, they failed again and again. Crews had to retension the tracks every 10 or 15 kilometers just to keep moving. Worse, it was often rushed to the front with crews who'd barely been trained to handle it. So a huge number of King Tigers were never destroyed by the enemy at all. They broke down. They ran dry, and their own crews blew them up and walked away. Because a 70-ton wreck was far too heavy to tow, and far too big to hide. But the deepest problem of all was something else entirely, the one that decides this whole story. The King Tiger was a defensive weapon at its absolute best. It sat still, hidden, waiting in ambush, letting the enemy come to it. On the attack moving forward, over bridges, across open ground, it was slow, fragile, and disappointing. Even Hitler himself was let down by how it performed when it first went into battle. The King Tiger's first real battle came in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, its reputation arrived long before it did. Allied tank crews had heard the stories of a German supertank that nothing could stop. And when the first shells bounced off its front, the terror seemed entirely justified. Dug in along a hedgerow or ridge, a single King Tiger could turn an entire field into a graveyard. But the reality was far smaller than the legend. There were never many of them, a handful here, a handful there, spread desperately thin. Yet the moment they had to move, to attack, to maneuver, the cracks appeared, engines overheated, transmissions shattered. Tanks threw their tracks on tight corners. In one of its very first actions near Caen, a battalion of King Tigers went into battle, and several were quickly lost, some to breakdowns rather than enemy fire. The truth is, King Tigers were rarely even encountered in most battles. They were too few, too fragile, and too often broken down miles behind the front. Legend told of an invincible monster roaming the battlefield at will. Reality was a magnificent machine that spent much of the war being repaired, towed, or abandoned. Its terror was real, but it was the terror of a cornered animal, not a conquering one. A king tiger sitting still, in ambush, was one of the deadliest things on Earth. A king tiger trying to go somewhere was a disaster waiting to happen, and in the last year of the war, Germany desperately needed tanks that could go somewhere. It needed tanks that could attack and advance and win back what was being lost. The king tiger could do none of those things. This was the tragedy of the king tiger. Germany built the perfect weapon for standing still and holding ground. At the exact moment in the war when standing still meant slowly, certainly, losing. It could kill anything it could reach. Trouble was, it could barely reach anything at all. Germany had built a magnificent shield and handed it to an army that had already lost the initiative. And far to the east, its enemy had built the exact opposite a weapon with only one purpose: to attack. This story begins with a gift the Germans never meant to give. In early 1943, on the Leningrad front, the Soviets captured a German Tiger, one nearly intact. They dragged it to a testing ground and did something simple and brutal. They lined up every gun they had and fired at it, one after another. What they found was alarming. Their own heavy tank, the KV, could no longer match what the Germans were fielding. The Soviets needed a new heavy tank, and they needed it fast. The job went to a brilliant designer named Joseph Kotin and his team, deep in the Ural factory city of Tankograd. Kotin was the Soviet Union's master of heavy tanks, a man they called, only half in jest, the Tank King. For years, he'd been wrestling with the same problem. The Soviets' old heavy tank, the KV, had once been a terror in its own right, but it was slow, clumsy, and no better armed than the far cheaper T-34. Crews complained. The army very nearly canceled it altogether. Kotin's team had patched it and repatched it, a bigger gun here. Thinner armor there, but it was a dead end. What they needed wasn't another patch. It was a clean break. They would build it in a place unlike any other on Earth. Tankograd Tank City was a colossal industrial complex in the Urals, safe beyond the reach of German bombers. It had been thrown together in 1941 from factories evacuated ahead of the German advance, and it existed to do one thing on a staggering scale: pour out tanks. This was the opposite of the German way. No handcrafted jewels here, only rugged machines by the thousand. It was the perfect birthplace for a tank meant not to be admired, but to be used and used up. Their old heavy tank had been named the KV, after the Soviet Marshal Kliment Voroshilov. But Voroshilov had fallen out of favor, so the new tank would carry a far greater name. It would be called the IS, the Joseph Stalin. Then came the decision that defined everything about it: the choice of its gun. Kotin's team reached for a truly enormous weapon. A 122mm cannon descended from a heavy field artillery piece. Getting that giant gun to work was a violent story all its own. To prove the 122 could kill a Tiger, the Soviets tested it against that captured German tank. The result was staggering. The huge shell punched clean through the Tiger's armor and out the other side. But taming a field gun for a cramped tank turret was dangerous work. During one firing trial, the gun's muzzle brake shattered under the enormous pressure. Jagged fragments blasted back toward the men watching. And among those observers, that day, stood a Soviet Marshal, Kliment Voroshilov himself. He was very nearly killed by the very weapon meant to save his country. The gun was redesigned, its muzzle brake rebuilt, and the danger tamed. But that near disaster tells you exactly what kind of weapon this was. It wasn't a delicate, precision instrument. It was a barely caged explosion. That raw, brutal power was exactly the point. Notice what that gun was really for. It wasn't designed first and foremost to duel other tanks. It was designed to smash things: bunkers, or buildings, gun positions, fortifications. Its shell was so massive that a single hit could level almost anything the Germans could hide behind. Its trade-offs were real, and the Soviets accepted them with open eyes. Its shells were so big and heavy that the gun could only fire 2 or 3 times a minute, and the tank could carry only 28 of them. But that was a price worth paying. because of what this tank was born to do. When Stalin himself watched a demonstration of the new tank, he is said to have summed up its entire purpose in a single sentence. "We will use this tank to win the war." Everything about the machine served that one goal. At around 46 tons, it was far lighter than the 70-ton King Tiger. It had thick, unsteeply sloped armor that could shrug off the feared German 88. Crucially, it was built cheaply, its armor cast, rather than painstakingly machined. Where the King Tiger was a handcrafted jewel built by the hundred, the IS-2 was built to pour out by the thousands. Nearly 4,000 of them would roll off the lines. But the real genius of the IS-2 wasn't the machine, it was how it was used. Soviet commanders gathered their IS-2s into elite guards' heavy tank regiments. These were the tip of the spear. Their job was to lead an attack straight into the strongest part of the German line. They would blast a hole through the bunkers and the anti-tank guns with those massive 122mm shells. And then the lighter T-34s, and the infantry would pour through the gap they'd torn open. The IS-2 wasn't built to wait. It was built to break through. It got its first taste of that job in the mud of Ukraine in early 1944. This tank rolled into battle as the Red Army tore westward, and the effect was immediate. Soviet crews claimed dozens of German Tigers and heavy tank destroyers knocked out, for the loss of only a handful of their own. Those early figures came from Soviet reports, so we should hold them lightly. But the message was unmistakable, and the Germans felt it. For years, the German 88 had been the thing Soviet tankers feared most. For the first time, they had a tank whose thick front could shrug that 88 off, and a gun that could tear open anything the Germans had. Quietly, the balance of terror on the battlefield had shifted. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the IS-2 was only just getting started. And in August 1944, the two titans finally met. At a bridgehead on the Vistula River, a handful of IS-2s ran straight into a force of brand new King Tigers. The King Tigers were fresh from the factory, their crews confident in the mightiest tank on Earth. But the ground at the bridgehead was soft and sandy, and 70-ton monsters do not love soft ground. Some of the great tanks bogged down or broke down before they could even close the distance. 11 Soviet tanks faced 14 of Germany's finest monsters. The Soviet crews were dug into prepared, hidden positions, and they held their fire. They let the King Tigers come closer until the range was short enough that even their slow gun couldn't miss. And the IS-2s held their ground, knocking out 4 of the King Tigers and driving the rest back. When the IS-2s finally opened up, their massive 122mm shells tore into the German giants. It was not a bloodless win. Several IS-2s were knocked out, and more were damaged. But when the smoke cleared, 4 of Germany's finest monsters were burning, and the rest were pulling back. Some of those King Tigers were later found abandoned, not shot to pieces, but simply broken down and left behind. The battering ram had proven it could take the fortress's best punch and hit back. But Sandemeier's was only a taste of what the IS-2 was truly built for. Its real purpose was the great offensives that broke the back of the German army. In the summer of 1944, in a colossal offensive called Bagration, the Red Army shattered an entire German army group. IS-2 regiments were the hammer at the very front of that blow, cracking open fortified lines so the flood behind could pour through. Then came the drive across Poland. In the winter of 1945, a lightning advance that carried Soviet tanks hundreds of kilometers in mere weeks. And in East Prussia, the IS-2s turned their guns on the ancient German fortress city of Königsberg. This was heavy tank work at its purest, blasting bunkers of forts and stone buildings apart, one enormous shell at a time, everywhere it went. The IS-2 did the same brutal job. It didn't wait to be attacked. It kicked the door down and walked straight in. This was a weapon that only made sense on the attack, and the Soviets were always attacking now. The Germans came to respect it deeply. They nicknamed it the Russian Tiger. One German general called the Stalin tank the finest in the world. But the IS-2 didn't earn its legend sitting still and being admired. It earned it by moving forward, always forward. And then it kept going toward the one target that would end the war. While the King Tiger waited in ambush for a war, it was already losing. The IS-2 was on the move, kicking down the door to the Reich itself. So let's score these two giants, honestly. Round by round. Firepower is the fascinating one, because it splits in two. As a pure tank killer, the King Tiger's long 88 was arguably the finest gun of the war, faster, flatter, and deadly accurate at long range. But the IS-2's 122 hit with far more brute force and could flatten a building the 88 could only chip. For dueling tanks, the edge goes to the King Tiger. For sheer destruction, it goes to the IS-2. Armor the King, Tiger's thicker. Near impenetrable front takes this round clearly. The one-on-one duel on open ground, the King Tiger's gun and armor give it the advantage. Though, as the Soviets proved, an IS-2 could absolutely still kill it. It's worth pausing on that duel, because the reality of it is brutal and simple. Both of these guns could kill the other tank. After the war, the Soviets hauled a captured King Tiger to their proving ground and tested the two weapons head to head. The German 88 could smash straight through the front of an IS-2, and the Soviet 122 could punch through the King Tiger's turret from well over a kilometer away. Up close, it could even crack open that famous frontal armor at the weld seams. So in a straight fight, on open ground, whoever landed the first clean hit usually won. That's where the King Tiger's gun had a real edge. It was faster and more accurate. The IS-2's giant gun hit like a wrecking ball, but it reloaded slowly, often just 2 or 3 shots a minute. In the seconds it took to load that huge shell, a German tank could fire several times over. So yes, in a clean one-on-one duel, the King Tiger held the advantage. But the Eastern Front worked differently. Clean one-on-one duels on open ground were the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, what decided a battle was which tank was even there running and pointed the right way. So on the pure machine, the King Tiger wins most of the rounds, just like the Tiger did before it. And now we score the rounds that actually decided the war. Reliability and mobility, the lighter IS-2 could actually go places. The King Tiger broke down trying. That round isn't close. It goes to the IS-2. Numbers nearly 4,000 against barely 500. The IS-2, overwhelmingly. And then the round that matters most of all purpose. Which tank was built for the war that was actually being fought? By 1944, that war was an offensive, a relentless Soviet drive west into Germany. The IS-2 was built for exactly that. The King Tiger was built for the war. Germany wished it was still fighting. So let's add up the final tally. The King Tiger wins firepower against tanks, armor, and the duel. The IS-2 wins reliability, mobility, numbers, sheer destructive power and purpose. And so it won the war. The King Tiger won the spec sheet and lost everything that actually mattered. It was a perfect answer to the wrong question. If you want to see that truth in its purest, cruelest form, look at what happened in December 1944. Germany gathered its last strength for one desperate gamble in the West, a massive surprise attack through the forests of the Ardennes. History remembers it as the Battle of the Bulge, and at the very tip of the German spear, they placed their most powerful tanks. The King Tigers, a defensive weapon built to sit still and ambush, was sent to lead a lightning offensive through narrow, twisting forest roads, over small country bridges. In the dead of winter, it was the wrong tank, for the wrong job, in the worst possible place. The spearhead was led by an SS officer named Joachim Pieper, a man whose unit murdered scores of American prisoners during that same offensive. Piper's King Tigers pushed forward, and for a few days, they terrified everything in their path. But the roads were too narrow, the bridges too weak, and the tanks far too thirsty. Bridges collapsed under 70 tons of steel. Others were blown before the Tigers could reach them. The advance slowed, then stalled, and then the Americans closed in around them. Piper's spearhead found itself trapped in a small Belgian village called La Glaise, surrounded, low on ammunition, and above all out of fuel. There was no way forward and no way back. So Piper made the only choice left to him. He ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and slip away on foot through the woods, back to the German lines. Around 800 men escaped into the night, and behind them, they left roughly 135 armored vehicles, including 6 of the mighty King Tigers. Most of them had no battle damage at all. They had simply run dry or broken down. One of those king tigers. Tank number 213 still sits in L'Église today. After the war, a local woman bought it from American scrap crews for the price of a single bottle of cognac. American soldiers had used the abandoned tigers for target practice, firing bazooka rounds at their armor. The armor held. Not a single shot punched through, even abandoned, even a scrap. The king tiger could not be destroyed, and it made no difference at all, because the finest armor in the world is worthless on a tank that has run out of gas. And now we have to talk about what that difference cost in human lives. Because the IS-2's purpose led it to the most terrible place of all the streets of Berlin. Remember the IS-2 we left frozen in the rubble? One heartbeat before it fired. This is that moment. Urban combat is a nightmare for a tank. Every window, every pile of rubble could hide a soldier with a Panzerfaust, a cheap rocket that could gut even an IS-2 at close range. Crews fought block by block, buttoned up inside a cramped steel box. With only 28 shells and a gun that reloaded painfully slowly, they rode Stalin's name straight into Hitler's capital, and many of them died in those ruins doing it. Think about what that actually meant. Hour after hour, a commander had to keep his head out of the hatch to see anything in those tangled streets, and that made him a target for every sniper in the rubble. Button up for safety, and you went half blind. Open up to see, and you risked a bullet. Whole crews burned alive when a Panzerfaust found the engine deck from a top-floor window. This was the ground the IS-2 was built to take, and it took it, one terrible street at a time. One IS-2 brigade alone smashed through the city's defenses, destroyed dozens of German tanks and hundreds of guns, and freed thousands of prisoners. Block by block, the Soviet heavy tanks ground toward the center of the city. They blasted strong points out of apartment buildings and cleared barricades with single, thunderous shots. Behind them came the infantry, and behind the infantry, more tanks. In a tide, the Germans could no longer stop. Berlin's defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed old men and teenage boys with Panzerfausts. Hiding in the ruins, every street was paid for in blood. On both sides, still the IS-2s pushed on, toward one final building at the very heart of the Reich, the Reichstag, the great symbol of German power. On the 30th of April, 1945, as Soviet troops fought their way inside, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker beneath the city. In the final days of the battle, a Red Army flag was raised over the shattered Reichstag. The war in Europe was all but over, and a tank named after Stalin had been there, at the very tip of the spear, when it ended. That was the price of a tank built to attack paid. Meter by bloody meter, in the enemy's capital. And the price of the King Tiger. This was a quieter, stranger kind of tragedy. Picture a German crew standing beside the finest tank ever built. It hasn't lost a battle. Its armor is unmarked. Its terrible gun still works. But the fuel tank is empty, and there is none left in all of Germany. There is nowhere left to fight, and no way to move 70 tons of steel out of the enemy's path. So the crew sets the charges and destroys the finest tank in the world with their own hands. Not beaten in battle, just left behind by a war. It was never built to fight, and when you step back, these two tanks tell the story of two completely different ways of thinking. Germany chased perfection, the thickest armor, the biggest gun, the ultimate unbeatable monster. In chasing that perfect weapon, it built tanks too expensive, too complex, and far too few. It fell in love with quality and forgot that a tank in a repair shop wins no battles. The Soviets thought in the opposite direction entirely. They didn't ask, what is the perfect tank? They asked, what tank do we actually need to do the job in front of us? Right now, the job was to attack and to break through again and again, all the way to Berlin. So they built a tank that was good enough to win and simple enough to build by the thousand. It wasn't as refined as a King Tiger. It didn't need to be. It needed to show up in overwhelming numbers and hit hard enough to smash the door open. And it did, every single time. This is the oldest lesson in all of warfare, written here in steel and fuel. The best weapon isn't the one with the most impressive numbers on paper. It's the one that fits the war you're actually fighting and that you can build enough of to matter. Germany built a masterpiece, The Soviet Union built a winner. So we end where we began, the tank named Stalin, grinding into the heart of the Reich. And behind it, on the empty roads, the greatest tanks ever built, burning killed by their own crews. The better tank lost, because it was built for the wrong war. But the tale has one final twist. The story of these two tanks didn't end in 1945. In a way, it was just beginning. The King Tiger, the strongest tank of the war, ended up a museum piece, a magnificent relic. Fewer than 500 were ever built, and only a handful survive. Sitting silent behind ropes, that absurd mouse became a single curiosity, gathering dust in a Russian museum. Germany's obsession with the perfect monster led, in the end, to a collection of oddities, but the IS-2, its bloodline lived on and it changed the world. Even before the war ended, the Soviets had built its successor, the IS-3. It carried the same brutal 100 to 22 millimeter gun, wrapped in a radical new sloped shell. It arrived too late to fight the Germans, but it made its entrance another way. In September 1945, at a victory parade in the ruins of Berlin, the Soviets rolled out 52 of them, and as those low, menacing shapes rumbled past the ground, trembling beneath them, the Western Allies stared in genuine shock. One story says, an American officer beside General Patton grew alarmed at the sight of them. Patton reportedly told him, "Relax, they're on our side." They weren't. Of course, not for very long. That parade is remembered as one of the first cold breaths of the Cold War. The IS-2's descendants, the IS-3, and then the T-10 would guard the Soviet Empire for decades. Its bloodline served on in armies around the world, all the way into the 1990s. The tank built to end one war went on to shape the next half-century of history, and the perfect monster that could never reach the fight became a statue. So we'll leave you with the question, which one was really the better tank? The perfect weapon that could kill anything, but could never get to the fight? Or the rougher, simpler one that was built to do a job, and did it all the way to Berlin? Maybe the best weapon was never the most powerful one. Maybe it was simply the one built for the war it actually had to fight. We've told you what we think decided it. Now we want to hear from you. If it were 1945, and you had to pick one to lead the assault, which tank would you have wanted at the front?
Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your support is incredibly valuable to us and helps this channel grow.